management, and most latterly, how to integrate sustainability and ESG type considerations as they're building those portfolios, what opportunities exist, what risks might need to be managed within the businesses that they're investing in. And as part of that work, one of my clients, this steel business that I'm now working for, said, wouldn't you come and oversee our sustainability program globally? So I then embarked on this fabulous voyage of discovery all the way from Australia, Eastern Europe, the UK, and the US to really understand some of these steel businesses, the environments that they were operating in, what the economies and regulatory landscape looked like, where they were operating, and how we could create a sustainability strategy that allowed them to transition profitably towards net zero production, whilst capturing all the data and community and reporting piece that was needed around all of that. So it's been a really interesting 5 years. I've never had a learning curve like it, I have to say, going from the safe and regulated world of financial services, sitting at a desk working with numbers and occasionally people and boards, to having a hard hat on in a furnace in Romania was a real culture shock. But it's been great working with environmental engineers, HR people, the finance teams of the different businesses to really understand what makes this tick and how we can make quite a fundamental change to these business models, and what we need to do to bring people along with us. So that's kind of where we are at the moment, and really happy to dive into the conversation. So.
No, thank you. And maybe what might be helpful for everyone first is if you could just give a little bit of overview on what is steel decarbonization? Where does that play into this whole network of climate solutions that we're talking about? Why is it really important? And what was really attractive to you about doing this work?
Right. Okay. So what I hadn't realized, I don't think fully before I took this job, was that we make about 240 kilograms of liquid steel every year for every person on the planet. So it is a massively used material, and that's only going to increase as we build more wind turbines, as the cities of the future look to more light and flexible materials. So there is no net zero world without net zero steel. Globally, we produce around 2 tons of CO2 for every ton of steel that's made. So that cannot persist, and we can't increase the amount of steel production if we're also seeking to have emissions fall globally. So it's really critical that we tackle some of these, in inverted commas, hard to abate sectors. It's sort of an existential piece for us. And I think that's what really attracted me to work in this field, is that it's not a fluffy bit of window dressing that goes on the side of a product. It's really, can these businesses survive, and can we move to a way in which we've got a viable net zero economy, still incorporating things like steel, concrete, glass, potentially aviation.
And having put a hard hat on now and sort of gone out and seen what's going on the ground, has that increased your confidence that we can do this, or has it tested it in certain ways?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit on the fence with that and say both. So it's really challenged some of the assumptions that I went in with. I thought this was a technology problem. It is not. So there are 2 ways that we can decarbonize steel production. The first is that we can recycle more steel by melting it in electric furnaces. And if we can use renewable electricity for that, that gives us decarbonized steel production. So that's the relatively straightforward piece. And we can get into the complexities of finding the volumes of renewable energy that we need for that process and where the scrap all comes from. But that's kind of pathway number 1. That doesn't address the full global demand for steel, though. So you still need a way of making virgin steel from iron ore. And the current process for that involves coal. And obviously that's where the carbon comes from. And that's a fundamental chemical requirement for the steelmaking process. So not easy to get away from that. Now, the way that technically you do that is you take very high grade iron ore, and you can use natural gas or hydrogen as the direct reduction agent to create pellets, which then can go into this electric furnace alongside the scrap to make liquid steel. So those are two pathways. Now, my view is that that was technically very difficult to do. In reality, all of those processes are and have been done before at reasonable scale. The problem we're now facing, I think, is more of a business problem than a technology problem. So we need to see a business case. And to put it really straightforwardly, as one of my CEOs of one of the businesses said to me, you're asking me to create the same product into the same market at the same price, but spend a vast amount of capex to change the process in order to do that. Where's the business justification for doing that? How can I sort of hand on heart say that that's something sensible to do? So when I look at these hard to abate sectors, it's not technically hard to do. It's expensive to abate at scale. It's unclear who should pay to abate. It's not incentivized to abate. So it's those things that I think require genuine collaboration across the value chain, from investors, suppliers, customers, really importantly, policy and government. And so I think that's the part where I'm a little bit more nervous. I can see the pathway for the technology. There are some cases where I can see the pure business case, but limited. But without that fundamental collaboration, I don't see it happening. And we've now got to a stage in the world where has that collaboration become more or less likely? And I think it really depends on the market in which you're operating.
Maybe what excites you the most about what you've seen so far in terms of as you're doing this work and interacting with different stakeholders and things like that? Do you see that there's a business case challenge, but a really strong desire on a lot of the organizations to do the work? Or what's the most inspiring part of the work that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think there's a recognition that it has to get done from most people. I think we've moved past the annoying phase that we were in about 10 years ago, where every board meeting you went to was a question of why are we doing this again? I think now it's a case of how do we do it and can we afford to do it? What I really find, in terms of the kind of optimistic view, I went to a global steel conference probably 6 months ago, and sustainable production was the biggest theme on the agenda, which again, you would not have seen that 5 years ago. So you've got some really, really smart people thinking about how to do this. The other great thing was it wasn't only steel people, it was people from small modular reactors that were manufacturing that. How can we co-locate that on steel plants? It was people looking at the ferroalloys that go into steel. It was people from the concrete and cement industry talking about what they've done and what lessons we can learn. So those little germs of working together across industry, that was very reassuring. And then the final thing I think is where the money comes from. That's what really unlocks this. And increasingly in conversations with large asset owners and institutional investors, I'm seeing a move away from just reporting on the carbon that exists within your portfolio. So effectively you can dump high emitting sectors, invest in tech, although tech's now becoming quite energy intensive, and you can decarbonize your portfolio. I think there's now an increasing recognition that we won't all be able to transition to net zero portfolios unless we facilitate decarbonization in the real economy. And to do that, you need to be investing in some of these heavy industries and incentivizing that and using stewardship and the cost of capital as a real lever to help these businesses decarbonize. So I think that narrative is certainly starting to change. So I think there's a lot to be celebrated around the progress that we've made in the last 3-5 years. There's still enormous headwinds, but those are the things that I'm positive and optimistic about.
You had mentioned for a little bit ago hard to abate as a term, and I wanted to just kind of take a step back and make sure that we're all at the same literacy level talking about some of these solution areas and some of these terms. So maybe we can collaboratively sort of define hard to abate for everyone here so that they understand exactly where you're coming from on that.
Yeah, so again, I think the definition has probably moved on. Hard to abate used to refer to industries that produced a lot of carbon, where the technology either didn't exist or was in its infancy around how you would do that. So airlines, shipping, steel, glass, concrete, all of these big heavy industries that create a lot of pollution and carbon emissions, where it's not immediately straightforward to switch to a different form of production or to reduce those emissions. I think now hard, as I say, is less about the technology existing, but more about how we bring those business cases together, how we do it at scale, and whether we can get the right policy and incentive structure in place to facilitate that shift. So it's now probably more expensive to abate, is the right term for it.
Mhm. One of the things that I really liked about about your story is, like you said, that process of putting your hard hat on and having to put your feet on the ground in different parts of the world and really see how things are done. And I feel for a lot of people who are, exploring the transition towards working on climate sustainability in some way, there's this sort of world of climate sustainability work that is behind the computer in a lot of ways. And there's the knowledge economy work of carbon accounting and reporting, um, different technologies, education, like some of the work that we do at Terra is something of that. And there's this understanding that we always have that at some point, like you said, it has to be also tangentially tied to the real economy, what's being done on the ground, because climate is ultimately a physical solution of molecules of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the things that are done to cause that, and really the burning that's done to do that, and how do we change the way that those things are generated. And so I'd be curious just to hear a little bit more about what that journey was like for you, kind of going from the actuarial work into, like you said, putting a hard hat on. I imagine you're encountering different people, different types of situations, kind of what we have in our heads as what's going on versus what's on the ground can be very different. And I always encourage folks to go see what's tangibly happening to your stuff, right? What's actually happening to the stuff you put in your recycling bin? Where is your energy being generated? Where is it happening, right? And it sounds like you really had to do that. And so I'd just be curious to hear more about what that experience was for you.
Yeah, sure. So there were a couple of things there. The first was right at the start. I took, I had a hypothesis that this wouldn't really work and wouldn't be sustainable if it wasn't embedded in the businesses. So if I created a team of people making spreadsheets at head office, I wasn't convinced that that would create the momentum and the level of change that would be needed for something of this magnitude across businesses spread out across the whole world, and probably wouldn't be meaningful enough. The other thing, being really honest, is I'm not very good at chemistry. I knew absolutely nothing about how steel was made. And so the idea that I would be able to pick this up from reading a book was well beyond me. I needed to go and actually see it happen and speak to people and have them explain it to me, and bless them, these environmental engineers who must have told me the same thing 20 different ways before I really got it. Um, but I think anyone who's been involved in large scale change management, that is what this is, particularly if you're working in one of these big businesses where, in order to transition to low carbon production, you've got to embark on big capex intensive projects. You've got to fundamentally change the skill sets that exist within the organization. You have to rethink the way that you're selling the end product to customers. Your marketing needs to change. Your legal teams have got to get their heads around new things. So it covers every part of the organization. And to think that you're going to be able to effect that change by creating some policies at head office is really not going to happen. So I think the fundamental thing for me was also, can I express this sustainability strategy for each of the businesses in a way that really ties into their business strategy? Because if I can't, I'm not sure, having come from a finance background and an investor background, I can't just slap sustainable on something and say, well, that's the strategy, off we go, without being able to explain how that impacts the business strategy and how it really facilitates that business strategy being achieved. And again, in order to do that, I thought it was really important to be in the markets in which these businesses operate, speak to the various people involved, have buy-in from the CEOs. This is never going to happen if the CEO of each business hasn't sanctioned it. Otherwise, people nod politely, and as soon as you back off on a plane, they stop doing what you think they should be doing. So for me, it was absolutely fundamental. I couldn't, there probably are people who can think of a better way of doing it. I couldn't. I thought, we've got to go in and do this business by business to really understand what it is that we should be prioritizing for them. I also think, as a sustainability person, if you look for anybody who's thinking about going into the world of sustainability, if you look at a potential job description, there is no way one person can be across all of these things. I can't come up with all of the technical solutions and do the reporting and the carbon accounting and do all the marketing and comms and come up with the glossy sustainability report and do the business modeling and the risk forecasting and scenario analysis and talk to investors and negotiate off-take deals with customers that justify why we're putting this capex in place. There's no way. So it has to, if it's going to be effective, it has to sit within each of the different teams who are tasked with doing that. And they've got to be upskilled in order to be able to deliver that sustainably.
Oh, thank you. What do you feel has been what was one thing that maybe surprised you the most going through the process, either on the challenge side or something that was more effective than you expected?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things that surprised me. The first was actually how well versed most people were already in this stuff. So it's a little bit crazy, I think, that we've created this whole new language around sustainability with CSRD and TCFD and ISSB, and you lose people very quickly. But actually, if you take the messaging back to something that's meaningful for that business and that market and that group of people, they already are doing a lot of this stuff and they're already progressing towards this. It's really a case of capturing that and putting it into a sensible strategy. So that was a pleasant surprise. I think the other thing that perhaps was a learning for me was I had not appreciated the sheer volume of electricity demand that's coming and the real challenges that are going to be associated with meeting that demand around the world. So I think we're probably going to see some real reshaping of supply chains to areas where there is an abundance of sun and wind and cheap renewable electricity, but that's going to be a bit painful. And also with the current geopolitical climate of bringing more things back onshore, I have some real concerns about how jurisdictions like Europe are going to meet the demands that are coming for electricity.
Mm-hmm. From what you were saying about the way that you're translating this work to the different business divisions and things like that, I imagine some of this language you might be using is around risk, some of it is around language around opportunities, and sort of ways to find more efficiencies and things. And so what's sort of been some of the more effective entry points in those conversations? And I imagine they were likely different in different places as well. But
Completely.
sort of translating your language that you maybe developed in the actuarial world and in your previous professional work to what you're speaking, what you're seeing that resonates with people in your conversations as you're building that momentum. What really, what were some of the things that stood out to you?
Yeah, so the first thing that stood out to me is that there is way too much to capture or hold the attention of any board or exco or group where you need to influence those stakeholders. So the first thing for me was really triaging. And that also helped me to get an understanding of the businesses. So the first thing I did was really simply to ask lots of questions about, in this business, what do our customers really care about? So for that market, for that product, what is it that they care about? What is it that the investors care about? And go talk to some of the banks that we were working with around genuinely what moves the dial for them in some of their assessment criteria. What matters for the regulators? In some jurisdictions, we would have been by far the biggest emitter. So if they've made commitments around decarbonisation, actually helping us to decarbonise is one of the main levers that they have in order to be able to do that. What about suppliers? What do they care about? What can they do? What can't they? What stage are they at? And again, for customers, what are their customers asking of them? And as a supplier to them, what do they think we're going to need to be able to do over the next 3, 5, 10 years? And have they fully understood what this transition means for them? And in that way, you start to arrive at some common themes for that business and that jurisdiction of things that really will turn the dial in terms of outcomes. And that's really then where I anchored it. So what's a risk for those key business drivers? What would really make a difference in terms of outcomes there? What are some of the opportunities that we could capture that we've heard as a result of those conversations? What do we need to be able to report on to be able to show progress against those metrics? And that was really how we started to build up the strategy. There were other things, for example, that are just required under regulation, which you have to get done. And then that was just a case of how can we most efficiently do that from the existing data and processes that we have available to us.
I imagine that it's not all a big expansion all at once. You see progress in different areas a little bit quicker. And so where were some of those? Where have you seen progress move faster? And why do you think it did move faster in those places?
Yeah, so I suppose low hanging fruit by definition was easier. So things like efficiency, putting energy drives in place that, using AI to model when the most efficient times were to use energy and how the machinery was working to, have minimal touches of the same piece of product, or if you didn't have to have it cool down before you heated it up again to do something else to it. So it's all of those things, which quite apart from reducing emissions also massively reduces energy usage and therefore massively reduces cost. So it's kind of a no-brainer if you can get that done, quick payback period. So the energy piece, I think, was a really easy, quick win for everyone to get behind. The other, I suppose, quite quick things were where we could run small pilots. So you'd be able to test something, whether that would be a new source of energy or co-locating something across, next to the steel plant, that we could use that energy and then see whether that would help. So I think it was those smaller scale things. Obviously, the big capex projects take a lot longer. The other things, I suppose it's important when we talk about sustainability that it's not just carbon emissions and it's not just environment. So what about some of the community engagement pieces? If you think about a steel plant, most of the plants that we operate would have been in areas where that was the main source of employment for communities over generations. So there was a lot of work done with local universities on forecasting what skills we were likely to need, making sure those skills were being offered, partnering with other local businesses to think about what might be needed in those areas, and even to the extent of getting school kids through the door to come and see the steel plant to do their own projects on how you might make this better for the environment, etc., so that they don't see it as a big scary dirty industry, but actually something where they can have more of an impact in creating a better future. So yeah, loads of things that can be done. And I guess it comes back to the point on what's going to be most impactful, where do you need to focus? But even things that may not look that impactful, I think just to get momentum going, it was useful to have a few quick wins, even if you haven't made that much progress on the bigger ticket items.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a common story I think we hear at a lot of organizations, right? There's the pilot projects to get people familiar with the technologies. There's the kind of cost savings and opportunities that just sort of build trust that your alignment is very much with supporting the business. There's, okay, what are these new ways to bring in innovation and ownership? And I think some of this educational stuff is really interesting in this situation. That's kind of those vanguard areas. How do you translate that momentum into the transformational work that in the back of your mind, I'm sure you know really has to be done?
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily in the back, it's really at the forefront. And it's at the forefront, I think, of most businesses operating in this space. It's really translating that into financial incentives. I think that's really the way that this gets done. Just because of the amount of capital that's required, this is a business decision. It requires huge amounts of financing. Probably most businesses are not financing that themselves. So there needs to be an articulation of where the return from this comes from. And but again, that's a case of chunking these into stages of a project and being able to demonstrate that you've got past certain gates. Otherwise, you go quiet for 10 years while this all comes on stream, whilst everybody's kind of wondering whether this transformation is happening and what it means for them. So I think there's a need to keep communicating as you go through these processes. But it's also, it's such a huge multi-team. I'm certainly not responsible for running 4 major capex projects across the whole world. It has to be done by the businesses themselves who are managing this, and they're doing that in connection with the local government, the customers that they're looking to offtake agreements with, the suppliers, the infrastructure, the capex providers. So these capex projects are huge, and I don't think anybody would be expecting that to happen overnight. But I think the importance really is to keep communicating as you hit the certain milestones as you go.
Within those all these people you have to work with, does it feel like most of them are aligned with you on the ultimate destination and this understanding of this is where we need to go? Or are you hitting, is there a lot of education that has to happen, or even maybe some level of political navigation you have to go through because there's different worldviews that you're encountering just about the work that's being done?
Yeah, so it is different in different jurisdictions. Um, but I think if we take Europe as an example, with the carbon tax that exists in Europe and free allowances are falling away for heavy industry, so we're increasingly going to have to pay that carbon tax. That's a real clear bottom line hit, and calls into question the viability of continuing to operate, really carbon intensive industries in Europe. And so that helps to really focus the mind on how do we start to reduce the carbon associated with our operations in that jurisdiction. For others, it's more about the opportunity. So in Australia, you have, deposits of really high quality, high grade iron ore. You've got abundant sunshine, really efficient solar capture, lots of wind energy, potential for hydrogen, supportive government policy. And so that's really how can we take that region and show that as almost a way forward for the rest of the world and a good example for the rest of the world. And that really inspires people behind that, but also opens up different markets for us. So whereby we may have sold iron ore, now we might be able to sell direct reduction iron pellets to a much wider market, a much broader market, higher premium for that. So it's a whole new range of products that we would be able to invest in. So I think it depends on which jurisdiction you're in. There are things that you can get people excited about or worried about, such that inspires action. But I think it's important to always come back to talking about it in business terms. And in some ways, I think there's the silver lining of this ESG backlash that we've seen is that we're now having to be really disciplined about the language that we use and the way that we describe some of these initiatives. It's no longer good enough to slap green or sustainability on something and assume that everyone's going to go gung-ho behind it. We're really having to dig a few layers deeper and explain why that's important to the business and over what time horizon and what risk or what opportunity does this specifically address. I don't think that's any bad thing, because it's the only way that we move this from a sentiment piece where people kind of flip-flop between whether they want to be on this bus or not, to something that's actually core to that business strategy succeeding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I'm most curious about is, you always see these sort of new startups coming out that where you look at the sort of emissions reduction targets of large organizations, and maybe they're saying 40% by 2040 or something like that. And then you see these new companies show up that say, oh, we can create this. And I know the concrete world a little bit more, but okay, we can create this zero carbon concrete or 80% emissions reduction and these big step changes. And I always wonder about okay, this sometimes you think about there's the technology sort of transition and all that, but also there's all of these business operations that these organizations have to move slowly. And so how do you navigate that balance of technological solutions and innovation with this sort of with organizational inertia and how something's done to either collaborate with that disruption, or or is that disruption even seen as really that much of a sort of business threat ultimately, just due to the scale of these operations?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think the greenfield sites coming up, and we have the same thing in steel where, they've raised a lot of money. There's nothing there now, but they've sort of built themselves a kind of hypothetical supply chain, raised capital, and they've kind of got spades in the ground to get started on building these low emission plants. I think that's quite exciting for a few reasons. One, I think if they can get this right, it creates a market and it creates a green premium for decarbonized products, which is helpful for everybody who's looking to move to that decarbonization piece. I think it also helps to test the technology at scale. Now, to your point about scale, I don't think we see it as a particular disruptor given the volumes that are coming out and the quite narrow market segment that is being addressed typically by these new greenfield sites. So I actually think it's something that we welcome because it's the front runner to a lot of the stuff that we will need to get done. And it's also really helpful when you're talking to investors and policymakers to be able to point to something that's already worked, that you're not kind of first of a kind mover. I think it's much more difficult for an existing site to transition potentially than it is for a new site to spring up because you've got legacy issues to deal with. You may have already invested in lining a blast furnace, for example, and that's 200 million that you spent, and you probably don't want to switch that off before it's run its course. So I think there are some difficulties around that, but no, largely I think we would view the increasing number of these greenfield sites popping up as overall positive. It at this stage doesn't look like that's a major disruptor. If anything, I think it helps to push the decarbonisation agenda for the existing players.
Sort of as a thread of that, there's also a lot of innovation happening on the mining side of different ways to discover and create materials and things like that. And obviously, we're sort of in this conversation, we've sort of we've been very carbon focused. We've sort of set aside other challenges with mining and things like that, both from an environmental standpoint and local communities and all of that. And there's also some really exciting things happening on the mining side. In Australia, you've got a couple large organizations that have really tried to be on the forefront of changing what they can do and what does it mean to be a net zero mine, and some of these questions that haven't really ever, I think folks haven't really tried to wrap their heads around yet. But what are you seeing on the mining side that is exciting for you, or gives you sort of I don't know, some inspiration or encouragement towards how the way that we do this, not only from a carbon standpoint, but from a broader environmental lens, has the potential to evolve?
Yeah, so I have to say I'm not an expert on the mining side. Our only mine is in South Australia, and it's a magnetite mine where we mine iron ore to go into our existing steel site, but then potentially also for this direct reduction to create the pellets that we can then ship. So I wouldn't be able to speak more broadly about mining itself. I think when I go to that mine, there is a lot of focus on environmental, so tailings management, really important. I think we've seen a number of disasters around the world on that, and that's really focused people's attention. So it was really heartening when I went there just to hear about the broader environmental management that goes into this, how they manage water, what the plan is for that. Obviously, it's an area where water is reasonably scarce, but they've got a really sensible circular approach to water management. Also, the emissions to water and to air, dust is a huge one because it's not actually that far away from a number of the communities. But also in Australia, some work with the local communities around the landscape is absolutely vital. So we do a lot of work with the local communities to make sure that they're comfortable and supportive of any further mining expansion. And we're really involved in those communities to the extent of various outreach programs where, we'll have women from those communities come and work in our businesses to understand what, potential careers exist outside of what they might have normally seen as role models in their um, families and communities, but all the way to walking the lands with people from those communities to really show them what our plans are and to figure out how we might need to change our plans to get them comfortable. So I think there's quite a lot being done. I can, as I say, only talk to that business, not mining more broadly, but I think it is an area of focus. And also an area of focus for investors. I think a lot of the large asset managers and institutional investors, when they're investing in the mining space, are very keen now to understand, given the number of high profile issues that we've had in that space, what people are doing to manage the risks associated with both environmental, but also the people side of things.
Oh, thanks for that. I know we're getting close to about a quarter to the hour, so I just wanted to pause. I know we've got 25 folks in the room who are listening, and for those of you who've been putting questions in the chat, I appreciate it. I've been trying to translate that into some things, but I see some popping up, so I wanted to just open to the community a little bit more. Soma, do you want to just come off mute and ask your question? I just saw you add one in there.
Sure, thanks, Seth. Yeah, my question was around the inputs to green steel, so green hydrogen, electric furnaces, renewable electricity. Which of these and others maybe are seeing real momentum today, and which are the critical bottlenecks? And how do we, at scale, what's kind of holding back cost parity between green hydrogen and fossil-derived hydrogen? Sorry, steel, I mean.
Yeah, great question. And I could talk on this all day. So Seth, please shut me up when I've got too boring and nerdy on this topic. Okay, so the inputs to green steel, as I say, there's these two strands. The one strand of electric arc furnaces, those inputs are scrap and green electricity, basically, are the two main things. I'd say the bottlenecks there are twofold. The first is actually availability of scrap. So in the UK, for example, we export most of our scrap, even though we have sufficient scrap to meet the full UK demand if we melt it through furnaces. And the reason for that is that we don't have the right scrap sorting policies in place, but also we don't see it as a critical raw material. It's seen as waste and it gets shipped off to other countries without really being processed properly. So that availability of the right type of scrap is a constraint, as is the type of steel you can viably make using scrap in a furnace. So if you're making really specialty steel, that's quite an involved process, which then still creates emissions, even though you're doing it through an electric furnace. The other difficulty with electric production, as I say, is just the volume of electricity that is needed to get to those temperatures and to create the steel. And you source reliably and cheaply enough renewable electricity to facilitate that process. And that's everything from, can you get the grid connections? Can you get the permits? What's the price of electricity? If you think about the price of electricity in the UK versus Europe versus India, Turkey, we're at a massive disadvantage in the UK and Europe in terms of what that electricity costs. So it's difficult to make a margin through that route of production at the moment. So that's the one strand. The other is this approach of taking high grade iron ore and using natural gas or hydrogen as the reduction agent so that it can then go off to these electric furnaces. And the inputs there are this very high grade iron ore. So that is a constraint. You needed to have a very high iron content in order for it to work with this different reducing process. And the locations of those grades of iron ore aren't typically where the steel plants used to be. So they're primarily in Africa, Brazil, the Nordics, and Australia. So there's a bit around having to reconfigure your supply chain of where you're getting this stuff from. And then green hydrogen. If if we need a lot of electricity to run our electric furnaces, the amount of electricity that we need to produce green hydrogen is even more. So the constraint there is really the volumes of energy that are needed, as well as the cost. And also, it's very difficult to transport hydrogen. So you really need to have the mine and the steelworks, and ideally that direct reduction plant all in the same place. And then you ship the pellets. So once you've embedded the hydrogen into those pellets, that makes it much more easy to transport. So we're quite fortunate in steel that you can co-locate the hydrogen on the steel plants. You don't have to transport it. But any industry where you're having to transport hydrogen, like shipping, for example, that makes that technology a lot more difficult and expensive to work with.
And this sounds very similar to, I think, a lot of the things that we generally talk about in the challenges of the electrification arc that we sort of need to go on for decarbonization, right? Which is just we're bringing so much more demand on the grid in all these different ways, and we require sort of new ways of thinking and new solutions in order to meet those needs. And I would be curious, like from your organization's perspective, almost from an advocacy standpoint, what are the asks that you make to, in your ideal world of how the system needs to shift so that you can do the things that you're trying to do most easily? Is that you're now also a renewable energy developer, the way that we see some of these data center companies doing that? Or are there other things that you look at or talk to the government about doing so that there is this space for you to achieve your goals in alignment with the governmental goals?
Yeah, so I've got a whole shopping list that I regularly roll out at things like this in terms of policy asks from government. I think there's a piece around electricity pricing. It depends which jurisdiction you're talking about, but certainly in the UK and Europe, something about the cost of electricity for industrials, I think, is really important. As you say, we have the opportunity to either buy or make the energy. So there are some plans where we're considering, do we spin up our own kind of energy production piece? You do run into difficulties with grid connections, permitting. So that's my second kind of ask of government. So it's first the cost and availability of renewables. The second is the time that it takes to get permitting and grid connections for some of these projects is out of line, I think, with what those countries have set themselves in terms of decarbonisation targets. I think something to speed up that permitting piece. But again, I think, a lot that would also unlock this is and unlock that capital investment is a really strong signal around public procurement. So if we heard a lot more and a stable policy environment around the types of products that the government will be procuring, and that comes to some of the standards around the definition of green steel, etc. Again, I think that helps to really create and the demand for these products. So I think you need the supply side, but you also need, I think, something that stimulates the demand so that you can unlock the capital that's needed for those investments.
Makes a lot of sense. Again, if anyone else has any questions, please feel welcome to either add them in the chat or just raise your hand or come up here to ask them. We're kind of in the last 10 minutes, and so I also wanted to make sure we talk about sort of the career transition piece of this, because so many of the folks who come to Terra and sort of come across us, a lot of them are thinking about, or at some stage of a professional transition. Maybe they're looking and thinking about transitioning towards work on climate sustainability. They've made that decision and they're in that process and along that arc, maybe running into some of those job descriptions, as you were explaining earlier, that are asking them to do everything. And some who've, I think, started working in climate sustainability as well, but are at those early stages and looking to guide and sort of continue to evolve and be more effective in the work that they're doing, and find new opportunities for how the organizations that they're working with can advance sustainability work broadly. And so I'd be curious to hear both maybe a little bit about what that transition was like for you, and maybe a little what advice you might have or some insights or tidbits from your journey that maybe you share with folks who come and ask you about this?
Yeah, so the transition was really scary for me, if I'm honest. It just seemed like this huge, overwhelming thing. And every time I asked a question, I got, 20 questions came back to me. And it was difficult to find out who was actually responsible for each thing. And if I did this, then someone would tell me, yeah, but there's this huge unintended consequence that you've just had over there. And so I think that that piece about really triaging for each of the underlying entities, what is it that's important? What is going to move the dial? And get people behind that and focus quite ruthlessly on getting those things done and be very honest to the various stakeholders about what we're not focusing on right now so that you can keep coming back to this is what we said we would do, this is our progress on that, and this is all the stuff that's in the parking lot. So being really quite conscious about that. I think in terms of the pieces of advice that I would have for anyone going into sustainability, probably the biggest one is to try to make yourself redundant. And that seems a little bit odd, but if you can ask yourself, what would need to be true in this organization for them to not need me anymore? That gives you a really good pathway to how you get this properly embedded in the business. So what would the marketing team need to be doing? What would the legal team need to be doing? How would the procurement team need to be functioning? So that there wasn't really a need anymore for a chief sustainability officer. Where does reporting sit? Should I be running around getting all this information, or is there a perfectly good reporting function where this could naturally go and find itself? And I think what that does is it stops you creating yourself as a bottleneck and means that you properly embed this in each of the various businesses and business functions. I'll caveat that with it takes a lot longer. So it's much quicker for you to just walk in, waving the thing and hire 20 people to do the reporting and 7 consultants to come up with the strategy and whatever else. But if you actually want it to work and to stay the course, I think it's really important that after 3 or 4 years, your role does not look the same as it does on day one. And you've actually got most of this working within the businesses themselves.
One question I'm always curious about is from Terra's standpoint, as an organization that really focuses on education, where have you seen education be a really essential part of the process in this organizational transformation process? And what are often do you see are like the biggest bottlenecks that education helps with?
Yeah, so I think the education piece is fundamental. This is organizational change management, and unless people are fluent in what it is that you're trying to achieve, you are not going to bring the organization with you in the way that you need to. So that I think is really important. Where I've seen education work best is if it's really tailored to the job role of the people that you're seeking to educate. So, for example, when I was working with the comms and marketing team, it wasn't necessary for them to understand the precise change in chemistry that needed to happen with the iron ore and the direct reduction piece. So, and you lose people very quickly. I think the messaging is really important. If I start talking about ISSB 2%, certain GHG protocols, it's quick for people to be able to switch off. In order to make education stick, I think it's got to be what matters for this team, what matters for this department, what is that individual trying to get done in their career? And then what are the skills that they need to be able to do that sustainably? And again, it takes a bit longer, it's a bit more difficult. It means you can't just roll out one thing to everybody unless you're just talking about, let's all get a basic understanding of what the words mean. But again, it's much more long lasting, it's much more useful. And by far the bigger uptake is if you can make the stuff relevant to the functions that you're trying to put the training into.
No, thanks for that. We have just a couple more minutes. Does anyone else who's here in the call want to ask any questions? Ben, possibly yourself, as you're on video. I always like to invite those folks in, but anyone else too. I know I'm sure there are some in here, and I imagine also this is an area where folks are a little bit less familiar. So also acknowledging that there's probably a lot of just absorbing that folks are doing.
Yeah, so I was just going to say thank you, Marian, for all the information, and Seth for moderating. I had a chance to listen to a panel at San Francisco Climate Week, and one of the investors was really focused on the just mining and extraction, and even from a thinking about sustainability for the next decade, the amount of mining that's going to have to take place. How do we align that in a sustainable way, or transition to existing sites to sustainable process, or the greenfield sites like you mentioned, Marian? And it seems daunting. And then to consider steel and iron ore specifically in the process, it leaves me feeling a little bleak, but I appreciate the additional background.
Yeah, the thing is, it's gonna need a lot of capital in order to do that, because as you say, we're gonna need to ramp up production and at the same time fundamentally change the production methods across steel, but also mining, etc. But if you look at the amount of capital required per ton of CO2 avoided, it actually looks like pretty good value, particularly when you put that against like an €80 carbon price in the EU. So I think there are ways that we can kind of make the business case for it. And it's heartening to hear that some investors are focused on that now. Mining used to be quite a dirty word in the investment world. But as I said at the beginning, I think investors are starting to come around to the idea now that they need to get their hands dirty with some of this stuff in order to facilitate that transition.
Great, thank you.
All right. Well, I think with that, we will wrap up. Just want to make sure we are respecting everybody's time and stay within the hour, because I feel like if we open up one more, we'll definitely go over. That's the way this goes. But Marian, again, I want to thank you so much for your time and your willingness to come here and share with everyone your insights and your knowledge. I think it's really great, even personally for myself, to deepen my understanding. And I really love these two layers that we've looked at both. I think there's a lot to take away from this conversation for any organization, not just steel or any hard to abate sector, or an expensive to abate sector. I think as we're shifting the verbiage, but also it's always, I think, really rich to understand what's going on the cutting edge of solutions in these spaces too, and how do you drive change at these big organizations that I think for some, they would say, like it or not, they need to shift for us all to get there. And I really liked what you said at the beginning. I felt like the tagline line of there's no net zero world without net zero steel. And so it's work that we have to do. So if you do have any closing messages that you'd like to leave everyone with, I'd always welcome that. And then maybe we'll all say thank you and sign off.
I'll just thank you very much for having me, and really happy to answer any questions afterwards if people want to reach out on LinkedIn or whatever. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It felt a little bit like group therapy, so thank you for that. It's been good fun.
Thank you, Marian. Really appreciate this. This was awesome.
I'm glad to hear.
Yeah, the community aspect, I think, is so important, especially these days. And I think for a lot of folks who are trying to drive sustainability change, it's always good to stay connected to other folks who are focused on that too, before we spread out into the world. But thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, however long that may be here. And Marian, once again, much appreciated, and take care.
Bye.